Hey guys, tonight we wander through the candlelit halls of a Castilian palace, where the walls seem to have more ears than the courtiers. You're padding softly over cold, worn stone, the air thick with the faint scent of beeswax polish and roasting meat from the kitchens below. Somewhere in the shadows, a narrow slit in the wall catches your eye. You pause, and through it, you glimpse the flicker of lamplight and the unmistakable movement of two people meeting in secret. That slit? Not for ventilation. No, this is one of King Alfonso XI's favorite little tricks. Alfonso, ruling Castile in the early 14th century, was known for his military campaigns against the Moors. But court whispers claim he also waged a private campaign for entertainment. It wasn't uncommon for nobles to enjoy gossip, but Alfonso, he apparently preferred first-hand research. Hidden passageways and viewing holes dotted his palaces. The idea, according to rumor, was that nothing delighted him more than catching his courtiers in moments they'd rather keep private. Historians still argue whether these peepholes were genuinely designed for spying, or if they were simply part of old architecture repurposed by a curious king. Either way, the effect was the same. You never quite knew if Alfonso was watching. And here's the quirky part. Alfonso had an official mistress, Leonor de Guzman, so adored that she rivaled the queen in influence. This wasn't a man desperate for attention. This was a man who wanted control of the entire courtly narrative. If he knew who was flirting with whom, who was plotting with whom, he could leverage it. Secrets were currency, and Alfonso was the banker. Picture it. You're a nervous courtier, dressed in velvet and brocade, invited to a private dinner. The king smiles, his gaze warm, too warm. Later, you walk past a tapestry and feel the tiniest breath of cool air from behind it. Do you dare look? Or do you hurry on, knowing that somewhere, behind that woven scene of hunting stags, eyes might be following you? One fringe tidbit. Architectural surveys of some surviving Castilian fortresses have indeed revealed oddly placed narrow slits, too low or too angled for defense. Were these the king's spy holes? No one can prove it, but it makes you wonder how many royal secrets were built right into the mortar. Of course, Alfonso wasn't only about bedroom intrigue. He was a competent ruler, leading successful campaigns and navigating alliances. But even in politics, the same principle applied. Watch everything, know everything, and never let anyone know just how much you've seen. It's the sort of ruling philosophy that leaves you sleeping with one eye open, even in your own chambers. So as you move deeper into the palace tonight, try not to brush against the walls too closely. Somewhere behind them, history says, the peeping prince might still be watching. You slip out of Castile and cross the chilly stone bridges into France, where a softer scent of lavender and beeswax hangs in the air. The court of Charles VI glows with gold thread tapestries and polished floors. But don't be fooled. Behind the perfumed civility, there's a marketplace of favors, and the currency isn't just coin. Charles VI, Charles the Beloved, early in his reign, and later, tragically, Charles the Mad, was not always in full command of his senses. But when he was lucid, he wielded charm like a sword, and more than one deal in his court was sealed in the privacy of a bedchamber rather than a council hall. The whispers go that a courtier could find their fortunes rise or collapse, depending on whom they could please behind closed doors. Historians still argue whether Charles personally orchestrated these bedroom negotiations or simply tolerated a system that suited him. Either way, the results were the same. Political advancement was often a matter of intimacy. Here's the mainstream fact. Charles's reign saw the eruption of the 100 Years' War's nastiest phases, and he often needed quick, decisive alliances. France's nobility was a tangle of egos and grudges, and sometimes subtle pleasures smoothed the way better than treaties. One particularly odd tidbit: the court kept a chamber known unofficially as La Salle de Velours, the Velvet Room. On paper, it was for private audiences with the king. In reality, it was a place where political bargaining often happened reclining, not standing. Imagine the scene. Tapestries pulled across the door, braziers burning low, and a pile of embroidered cushions on the floor where the real business of the kingdom was conducted in whispers. You drift through that room now, your fingertips brushing the thick fabric walls, the velvet sucking up the sound of your steps. A lady in shimmering green silk passes, her eyes cool, her smile unreadable. You've no idea if she's here to discuss taxes or to secure her cousin's dukedom, and in this court, those might be the same thing. And here's the sly genius of it. Whether or not Charles initiated these arrangements, he benefited from them. If two rival nobles were bound together by shared secrets or shared partners, they were far less likely to rebel. This is court politics as social engineering, and while it feels decadent, it's also ruthlessly practical. Still, the cracks show. Charles's mental instability worsened over time. There are documented episodes where he claimed to be made of glass and feared shattering. In those moments, the velvet room fell silent. The court watched nervously, and the political games paused. But only for a moment. The deals always started up again once the king recovered, because in France, the kingdom was stitched together as much by whispers in the dark as by royal decrees. So tonight, as you slip out of that chamber and into the long corridor toward the torchlit gardens, remember? In Charles VI's France, your place at the royal table wasn't just earned with loyalty or bravery. Sometimes it was negotiated between silk sheets. Steam curls around you as you push open the heavy wooden door, and instantly the winter chill is gone. You've stepped into King Matthias Corvinus's private bathhouse, though calling it a bathhouse is like calling Notre Dame a nice little chapel. The air is thick with the scent of heated mineral water, perfumed oils, and something faintly herbal drifting from copper bowls set on low tripods. You can hear the muffled splash of water and the low hum of conversation, though the words dissolve into the echoes before they reach you. Matthias, ruling Hungary in the late 15th century, was famous for his military campaigns, humanist education, and cultural patronage. But ask the palace staff off the record, and they'll tell you the king was equally known for holding court in these steamy chambers. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were just luxurious alternatives to chilly council rooms, or if they doubled as discreet, invitation-only affairs where alliances were forged skin to skin. Mainstream history will give you his crowning achievements. Matthias built one of Europe's greatest libraries, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, rivaling even the Vatican's. But here's the quirky tidbit. Many of the diplomatic breakthroughs during his reign seemed to follow a week or two after a visiting ambassador enjoyed an extended stay in the royal baths. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the steam, wine, and carefully chosen company loosened tongues and softened stances better than formal speeches. You wade deeper into the warm, tiled space, your footsteps sending ripples through ankle-deep water pooled along the floor. Pillars painted with gold leaf vines shimmer in the lamplight, and through the haze you see the king himself, lean, sharp-eyed, with a towel draped over one shoulder. He's laughing at something a young noble just whispered to him, and you can tell the rest of the room is watching for his reaction like gamblers awaiting a dice throw. The ritual is as much about performance as comfort. Guests recline on marble benches while attendants pour warm water scented with rose or clove over their shoulders. Platters of figs, almonds, and candied citrus circulate on silver trays. Someone plucks at a lute in the corner, its notes faint and wavering in the heavy air. If you were a foreign envoy, this would be the perfect place to feel both honored and ever so slightly vulnerable. Half-dressed, your skin slick with sweat, your voice carrying farther than you intend. And yet, there's a side to Matthias that even his closest friends might not guess. His bathhouse wasn't just an indulgence, it was a carefully engineered space. The acoustics? Perfect for overhearing. The heat? Just enough to encourage wine drinking, which in turn encouraged loose conversation. The seating? Arranged so Matthias could keep an eye on everyone without appearing to. You don't need hidden peepholes when the whole room is your stage. Of course, there were nights when the baths were simply for pleasure. A poet might be summoned to recite verses by candlelight, or a troupe of musicians would slip in, their instruments gleaming like treasure. The warm air blurred the lines between diplomacy, entertainment, and something more personal. And so you stand, letting the steam wrap around you, realizing that in Matthias's Hungary, the fate of cities and kingdoms might just be decided not over a war table, but in the shimmer of lamplight on hot water. The sound hits you before the scent does. A rolling tide of laughter, lute music, and the rhythmic clap of hands keeping time to some bawdy song whose words you can't quite catch. You're stepping into the great hall of King Edward II of England, and the air is so thick with roasted meat smoke, wine fumes, and perfume that you almost stagger. Edward, early 14th century ruler, is remembered in official chronicles for political blunders, baronial rebellions, and a disastrous military defeat at Bannockburn. But if you were here in person, you might think his legacy was throwing the most shamelessly extravagant feasts in medieval Europe. This isn't just a meal, it's a performance. Whole boars stuffed with smaller game, candied fruit sculpted into the shapes of ships, pies from which live doves burst when sliced open. The food itself is a spectacle, but it's the after-dinner activities that keep tongues wagging across the kingdom. Mainstream fact? Edward had favorites, Gaveston and later the Despenser family, whose closeness to the king stirred fury among the nobility. Quirky tidbit? Some of Edward's private banquets blurred the lines between political gatherings and riotous after-parties. There are surviving accounts of disguisings, where courtiers donned masks and swapped clothes for the evening, slipping away into curtained alcoves while the wine kept flowing. Historians still argue whether these events were innocent revelry or deliberate political statements, a way for Edward to mock the rigid hierarchy of his court. You move between tables, sidestepping a pair of minstrels juggling goblets for the crowd. Someone grabs your arm and presses a silver cup into your hand, the wine inside sweet and spiced with cinnamon. Across the hall, a knot of masked figures dances in a circle, their silks swirling in the torchlight. Above them, banners hang heavy with the Plantagenet lions. But here, in this moment, rank is blurred. A baron might be speaking to a servant girl without either acknowledging their usual places in the world. And Edward? He's not just presiding, he's in the thick of it. His laugh carries across the room as he leans close to a masked companion, whispering something that sends them into a fit of giggles. He thrives in this chaos where alliances form not through formal council meetings, but in shared jokes, flirtations, and whispered deals under the music. The hall smells of rosemary, meat fat, and the faint metallic tang of spilled wine soaking into the rushes on the floor. The heat from the great fire roars against your face, and yet the room feels charged in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. Of course, outside these walls, the barons are sharpening their swords, furious at the king's favoritism and apparent disregard for serious governance. But here, under the flicker of torches and the pounding of drums, you can almost believe the kingdom runs on merriment alone. You take another sip, feeling the spice of the wine on your tongue, and realize the truth. Edward's court isn't just about pleasure, it's about control. When everyone's mask is on, no one quite knows who's holding the upper hand. And Edward likes it that way. The night air is warmer here, heavy with the scent of orange blossoms drifting over marble courtyards. You've crossed the Alps into Renaissance Rome, and the city hums with ambition. It's not the quiet piety you might expect from the heart of Christendom. Instead, it's a mix of sandalwood incense, gold coin, and rumor. You're here to meet Cesare Borgia, the infamous son, though nephew was the polite fiction, of Pope Alexander VI. Cesare isn't a king in title, but in power and appetite. He could rival any crowned head. His father's papal court is no monastery. It's a place where politics and personal pleasure intertwine like vines. Mainstream fact: Cesare's rapid rise from cardinal to military commander reshaped Italy's political map. But the quieter truth is that his influence was greased by a network of carefully managed liaisons and calculated seductions. Historians still argue whether Cesare used these relationships purely as tools of statecraft, or whether the pleasures themselves were part of the reward. You step into a candlelit chamber lined with frescoes of mythic lovers, Venus and Mars, Leda and the Swan, rendered in colors so vivid they seem almost alive in the flicker of light. In the center, Cesare reclines on a carved walnut chair, one hand loosely holding a goblet, the other gesturing as a diplomat from Naples makes his case. The words are smooth, but the real negotiation is happening in the glances exchanged between the guests and the courtesans, drifting silently along the walls. Here's the quirky tidbit. Contemporary rumors claimed the Borgias hosted masked suppers, where the wine was as strong as the entertainment was suggestive. Whether these events were as scandalous as their enemies described is another matter entirely. The family's rivals had a vested interest in painting them as moral degenerates. Still, enough independent accounts mention music, dancing, and sudden disappearances into side chambers to make you think there's more than smoke behind the fire. Cesare's genius lay in his ability to mix pleasure with intimidation. A noble might leave his table flattered, flustered, and entirely aware that the same charm could just as easily be turned against him. It's politics by way of seduction, a dangerous game in a city where daggers hide as easily as smiles. The music swells, lutes, viols, and the low hum of voices, and you catch sight of the Pope himself at the far end of the room. Alexander VI is old but sharp-eyed, his presence both a blessing and a warning. This is a family enterprise, and every dance step, every toast, every stolen glance feeds into the Borgia's grand strategy. You drift toward the open balcony, the warm night wrapping around you. Below, the Tiber glints under a half-moon, and you can hear distant laughter from another palace across the city. Rome at night is a web, and Cesare is one of the spiders at its center, pulling threads in ways that make war, peace, and pleasure all part of the same pattern. Here, deals are sealed not just with ink and wax, but with lingering touches and shared secrets. And if you think you're immune to it, wait until Cesare turns his full attention on you. The air shifts again as you move north into Bavaria, and the mood changes from Rome's sultry nights to something far more theatrical. You're in the late 19th century now, already past the medieval age in calendar years, but in spirit, King Ludwig II is still staging his own private Middle Ages. The corridors here don't just lead to rooms, they lead to sets, like the wings of a playhouse, velvet curtains, painted backdrops of moonlit forests, and the faint scent of mothballs clinging to costumes that look like they've been lifted straight from a knight's romance. Ludwig is remembered today for his fairy tale castles, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, dreamlike creations that seem designed for operas, not politics. But behind the fairy tale facade, there's a more private obsession: costumes. Mainstream fact: Ludwig was a devoted patron of composer Richard Wagner, spending staggering sums to bring his operas to life. Quirky tidbit: he didn't just watch Wagner's characters, he dressed as them. Historians still argue whether Ludwig's elaborate roleplay was a harmless eccentricity, a form of escapism, or part of deeper political theater aimed at reshaping his own image. You enter one of his private chambers and find racks of garments, embroidered doublets, jeweled crowns, flowing cloaks lined with fur. There's a blue and gold surcoat that might belong to Lohengrin, a set of shining greaves from Tannhäuser, even a peasant's smock, because no role was too humble for Ludwig if it fit the story he wanted to tell. He often summoned a tiny inner circle to these costume nights, where they'd eat by candlelight, in rooms redecorated to match whichever legend they were reenacting. Sometimes it was Arthurian court, cups of spiced wine, haunches of roast venison, tapestries showing quests and dragons. Other nights it was medieval Bavaria, complete with folk songs and shepherd's pies served on wooden trenchers. You stand in the corner as Ludwig sweeps in, his cloak brushing the parquet floor. He's wearing a silver circlet and speaking in a low, deliberate voice, not as himself, but as a character from some Wagnerian epic. The courtiers respond in kind, their modern titles slipping away in favor of made-up knightly ones. It's all absurdly committed, like a court-wide masquerade, but without masks. And yet, there's a subtle power here. In these moments, Ludwig dictates not just the conversation, but the very reality everyone is playing in. If he declares you're a noble champion, you are won, at least for the evening. If he decides you've betrayed the realm, You might spend the night banished to the far table. It's silly, but also oddly binding. For Ludwig, these nights may have been more than games. They were escapes from the grinding expectations of kingship, and perhaps a quiet act of rebellion against a modern world that left him little space to dream. But they also cemented his control over his closest circle, binding them in loyalty through shared fantasy. As you leave, you pass a mirror and catch your own reflection. Somewhere along the way, you've acquired a feathered cap, and you realize you've been playing along without even thinking about it. In Ludwig's Bavaria, reality is just another costume, and he's the one who decides when you take it off. The scent of incense hits you before you've even crossed the marble threshold, a thick, almost cloying perfume of myrrh and cinnamon that clings to the air like velvet. You're not in medieval Europe anymore. You've stepped into the palatial chambers of Rome in the early 3rd century, during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus. His court is less imperial administration and more personal theater, and tonight, the main production is a wedding. The thing is, Elagabalus didn't just marry once or twice. Mainstream fact? He married at least 5 times, sometimes to women, sometimes to men, and not all of them lasted long enough for the ink to dry on the contracts. Historians still argue whether these unions were acts of genuine passion, political maneuvering, or just part of the emperor's endless appetite for spectacle. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim Elagabalus once staged an entire public wedding ceremony to a chariot driver he adored, complete with flowers, banquet, and the city's elite invited to witness it. Another time, he reportedly married a Vestal virgin, a union so sacrilegious that even the jaded Roman public gasped. Whether these reports are exaggerated or not, one thing is clear. Elagabalus loved weddings almost as much as most people loved avoiding them. You move through a colonnade draped in purple silks, the torches throwing gold light across walls painted with mythic lovers. In the central hall, musicians pluck at lyres and pipes, their melodies weaving between bursts of applause. The bride, or is it groom, is arriving now, shimmering in fabrics imported from Syria, their hair pinned with pearl combs. Elagabalus himself beams, clad in robes embroidered with gold suns, a subtle nod to his role as high priest of the sun god Elagabal. The whole scene feels both intimate and wildly public. Courtiers laugh and whisper, the smell of roasting peacock and honey-glazed dates mingling with the heavy incense. And you notice something odd. These weddings often double as political resets. A rival's daughter suddenly becomes family. A former enemy is now linked by marriage. And when the marriage ends, sometimes in mere weeks, so does the alliance. Elagabalus doesn't just wed people, he weds ideas, factions, and appearances. Each ceremony is a performance meant to shock, charm, or distract. One week, the empire is buzzing about military threats from the north. The next, it's too busy gossiping about who the emperor's next spouse will be. It's chaos, but it's chaos under his control. You're swept toward the banquet tables, where platters of figs and pomegranates are passed alongside goblets of wine spiced with saffron. Somewhere, a poet is reciting verses so florid they almost drip from the air. The marriage may not last the season, but for tonight, the empire is united in fascination. And as you watch the emperor lean across the table to feed his new spouse a slice of honey cake, you realize something. Elagabalus isn't just unpredictable. He's weaponized unpredictability itself. In a court where alliances shift with each vow spoken, the only constant is that tomorrow there might be another wedding. The Adriatic wind is sharp tonight, carrying the scent of salt and candle smoke through Venice's winding canals. Gondolas glide under moonlit bridges, their oars slicing the black water with soft, steady strokes. You've arrived at the Doge's palace, where Doge Pietro IV Corner has transformed a formal political summit into one of his infamous masked gatherings. Mainstream fact? Venice in the late medieval and early Renaissance era thrived on diplomacy, alliances with distant kingdoms, trade pacts with powers across the Mediterranean. Quirky tidbit. In Pietro IV's time, some of these negotiations took place not in council chambers, but in lavish masquerades where the masks made it deliciously unclear who was speaking to whom. Historians still argue whether these parties were strategic social mixers or simply indulgences that happened to yield political benefits. You enter through a side hall lined with marble columns, each carved with curling acanthus leaves. The main chamber opens before you like a scene from a dream. The walls are painted with scenes of Venetian naval triumphs, but tonight they're half hidden behind draped silks and garlands of jasmine. Musicians in red and gold livery play viols and shawms from a raised gallery, the music curling down like smoke. Everywhere there are masks. Some are simple, white with delicate gold filigree. Others are outrageous, sprouting feathers or curling horns, painted in vivid blues and greens. You try to guess who's behind them, but it's impossible. A foreign envoy might be whispering to a merchant's wife. A rival noble could be laughing with a supposed enemy. The anonymity is intoxicating. Pietro IV moves through the crowd in a black mask edged with silver, his voice low, his hand occasionally resting on a guest's elbow. Deals are struck here with a touch on the arm, a shared dance, or a quiet walk along the palace's arched balconies. If anyone notices that official agendas are being rewritten mid-party, they say nothing. The masquerade gives everyone an excuse to speak freely and to deny everything the next day. The food is as much a performance as the masks. Almond pastries shaped like sea creatures, candied citrus glowing like little lanterns, and tiny salted fish arranged to look like they're leaping from the platter. Servants drift through the crowd offering goblets of chilled white wine, its surface shimmering in the candlelight. And then, the subtle shift. Some guests peel away to private rooms, the laughter from within just audible over the music. Others gather in small knots, speaking in a mix of Italian, French, and Spanish. No one notices, or pretends not to notice, when a masked figure slips away from the hall entirely, escorted by someone whose identity is equally hidden. For Pietro IV, these events are both pleasure and policy. In a city where wealth is measured as much in secrets as in gold, the masquerade is the perfect stage. You leave the palace later, the salt air biting at your cheeks, and realize you've been speaking all night without once knowing exactly who you were speaking to. And that's the point. In Venice, the mask doesn't just hide your face, it frees your tongue. The air smells faintly of beeswax and rosewater as you step into Westminster Hall, though tonight it's not the solemn seat of English governance. It's been transformed into something closer to a whimsical theater. The year is the late 14th century, and Richard II is on the throne. Official portraits show him as aloof and regal, but here in his private entertainments, he's more like an overgrown child playing make-believe. Only the games have real political ripples. Mainstream fact. Richard was known for his love of pageantry, ceremony, and splendor, commissioning elaborate works of art and staging events of almost absurd grandeur. Quirky tidbit, some of those events were essentially romantic performances, with courtiers assigned roles in carefully scripted entertainments that blurred reality and fantasy. Historians still argue whether Richard's taste for elaborate pageants was genuine personal indulgence or a deliberate political tool to reinforce his image as a divinely appointed monarch. You're standing near a dais where the king, dressed in robes heavy with gold embroidery, presides over what appears to be a reenactment of a knightly romance. Courtiers in jewel-toned tunics and flower crowns move through choreographed quests, rescuing maidens, played by other courtiers, and presenting them with symbolic tokens, rings, ribbons, carved ivory combs. The whole thing feels like a medieval soap opera, except the audience is also the cast. Here's the thing. If Richard assigns you the role of a brave knight, you spend the evening basking in his favor. If he casts you as the bumbling squire or the scheming rival, everyone in court sees it as a hint about your current standing with the king. In this way, the games become a very public barometer of loyalty and influence. From your vantage point, you see a young courtier kneel before a lady and recite a poem that's just a little too personal to be entirely fictional. Across the hall, another quest is interrupted when two knights, supposedly allies, begin improvising insults. Richard watches it all with an expression somewhere between amusement and calculation. The hall is lit by hundreds of beeswax candles, their flames reflecting in the polished brass of the musicians' instruments. Minstrels play gentle airs while servants glide between the actors, offering honey cakes and mulled wine. Somewhere behind you, someone laughs a little too loudly, and you glance back to see a pair of courtiers slipping away through a side door, still in their ridiculous pageant costumes. It's all absurd, yes, but it's also dangerous. The games Richard plays in this candlelit space ripple outward into the real political landscape. A public slight in the story can foreshadow a very real loss of favor. A romantic pairing in the pageant can spark actual court gossip that might bind or divide powerful families. As the evening winds down, the king rises, offers a languid wave, and leaves the hall without ceremony. The courtiers bow low, their costumes suddenly looking a little foolish now that the king's gaze has gone. You realize the play is over, but the consequences are only just beginning. In Richard II's court, growing up might be optional, but playing along is mandatory. The first thing you notice is the scent: fresh earth, crushed petals, and something faintly sweet like ripened figs. You're standing in the secret gardens of King Francois I of France, though garden hardly does it justice. This is a living gallery, a carefully curated labyrinth of plants, sculptures, and whispered conversations hidden behind high stone walls and guarded gates. Mainstream fact? Francois I, early 16th century, was the quintessential Renaissance monarch, patron of Leonardo da Vinci, builder of grand chateaux, and champion of the arts. Quirky tidbit? Beyond the famous royal gardens open to nobles and foreign dignitaries, there were private enclosures where invitations were rare and activities less botanical. Historians still argue whether these spaces were purely romantic retreats for the king and his companions, or whether they doubled as informal negotiation grounds for France's most sensitive political dealings. You follow a winding gravel path under an archway draped with blooming wisteria. The moonlight catches on marble nymphs frozen mid-dance, their faces half hidden by leaves. Ahead, you hear low voices and the faint chime of crystal goblets. Rounding a bend, you find a small pavilion lit by lanterns. The king himself is there, seated casually on a cushioned bench, his doublet unbuttoned at the throat, his smile warm but calculating. A lady in a gown the color of deep wine leans toward him, her hand brushing his as she makes some murmured point. Two other courtiers sit nearby, pretending not to listen but clearly catching every word. The conversation drifts from poetry to hunting to something far more delicate, the placement of troops along the border. It's all done with the lightness of small talk, but the stakes are heavy. One corner of the garden is devoted to exotic plants brought from overseas expeditions. Citrus trees from Italy, tulips from the Ottoman Empire, even a few rare orchids that seem to glow in the lantern light. Francois delights in showing these to guests, often lingering just long enough in the shadows between plantings for a private word or stolen glance. The air's warm tonight, heavy with the fragrance of jasmine and roses. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain murmurs over carved stone, masking the quieter exchanges between those strolling the paths. You notice that the layout of the garden itself encourages privacy. The turns are tight, the hedges tall, and every few steps you're hidden from sight. Whether by design or happy accident, it's the perfect place for secrets to bloom alongside the flowers. A servant appears silently with a tray of candied fruits and sweet wine. Francois takes a piece of candied orange peel, offers one to the lady beside him, and the whole exchange feels like part of a performance, one in which you can't tell whether the main subject is the fruit, the woman, or the watching courtiers. By the time you leave the garden, the moon has shifted higher, silvering the leaves. You can't help but think that for Francois, politics and pleasure are just two vines twisting around the same trellis. In his garden of delights, every conversation is a seed, and the king chooses carefully which ones he wants to grow. The first thing you notice is the scent: fresh earth, crushed petals, and something faintly sweet like ripened figs. You're standing in the secret gardens of King Francois I of France, though garden hardly does it justice. This is a living gallery, a carefully curated labyrinth of plants, sculptures, and whispered conversations hidden behind high stone walls and guarded gates. Mainstream fact: Francois I, early 16th century, was the quintessential Renaissance monarch, patron of Leonardo da Vinci, builder of grand chateaux, and champion of the arts. Quirky tidbit: beyond the famous royal gardens open to nobles and foreign dignitaries, there were private enclosures where invitations were rare and activities less botanical. Historians still argue whether these spaces were purely romantic retreats for the king and his companions, or whether they doubled as informal negotiation grounds for France's most sensitive political dealings. You follow a winding gravel path under an archway draped with blooming wisteria. The moonlight catches on marble nymphs frozen mid-dance, their faces half hidden by leaves. Ahead, you hear low voices and the faint chime of crystal goblets. Rounding a bend, you find a small pavilion lit by lanterns. The king himself is there, seated casually on a cushioned bench, his doublet unbuttoned at the throat, his smile warm but calculating. A lady in a gown the color of deep wine leans toward him, her hand brushing his as she makes some murmured point. Two other courtiers sit nearby, pretending not to listen but clearly catching every word. The conversation drifts from poetry to hunting to something far more delicate: the placement of troops along the border. It's all done with the lightness of small talk, but the stakes are heavy. One corner of the garden is devoted to exotic plants brought from overseas expeditions: citrus trees from Italy, tulips from the Ottoman Empire, even a few rare orchids that seem to glow in the lantern light. Francois delights in showing these to guests, often lingering just long enough in the shadows between plantings for a private word or stolen glance. The air is warm tonight, heavy with the fragrance of jasmine and roses. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain murmurs over carved stone, masking the quieter exchanges between those strolling the paths. You notice that the layout of the garden itself encourages privacy. The turns are tight, the hedges tall, and every few steps you're hidden from sight. Whether by design or happy accident, it's the perfect place for secrets to bloom alongside the flowers. A servant appears silently with a tray of candied fruits and sweet wine. Francois takes a piece of candied orange peel, offers one to the lady beside him, and the whole exchange feels like part of a performance, one in which you can't tell whether the main subject is the fruit, the woman, or the watching courtiers. By the time you leave the garden, the moon has shifted higher, silvering the leaves. You can't help but think that for Francois, politics and pleasure are just two vines twisting around the same trellis. In his garden of delights, every conversation is a seed, and the king chooses carefully which ones he wants to grow. The scent of incense hits you before you've even crossed the marble threshold, a thick, almost cloying perfume of myrrh and cinnamon that clings to the air like velvet. You're not in medieval Europe anymore. You've stepped into the palatial chambers of Rome in the early 3rd century, during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus. His court is less imperial administration and more personal theater, and tonight, the main production is a wedding. The thing is, Elagabalus didn't just marry once or twice. Mainstream fact? He married at least 5 times, sometimes to women, sometimes to men, and not all of them lasted long enough for the ink to dry on the contracts. Historians still argue whether these unions were acts of genuine passion, political maneuvering, or just part of the emperor's endless appetite for spectacle. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim Elagabalus once staged an entire public wedding ceremony to a chariot driver he adored, complete with flowers, banquet, and the city's elite invited to witness it. Another time, he reportedly married a Vestal virgin, a union so sacrilegious that even the jaded Roman public gasped. Whether these reports are exaggerated or not, one thing is clear. Elagabalus loved weddings almost as much as most people loved avoiding them. You move through a colonnade draped in purple silks, the torches throwing gold light across walls painted with mythic lovers. In the central hall, musicians pluck at lyres and pipes, their melodies weaving between bursts of applause. The bride, or is it groom, is arriving now, shimmering in fabrics imported from Syria, their hair pinned with pearl combs. Elagabalus himself beams, clad in robes embroidered with gold suns, a subtle nod to his role as high priest of the sun god Elagabal. The whole scene feels both intimate and wildly public. Courtiers laugh and whisper, the smell of roasting peacock and honey-glazed dates mingling with the heavy incense. And you notice something odd. These weddings often double as political resets. A rival's daughter suddenly becomes family. A former enemy is now linked by marriage. And when the marriage ends, sometimes in mere weeks, so does the alliance. Elagabalus doesn't just wed people, he weds ideas, factions, and appearances. Each ceremony is a performance meant to shock, charm, or distract. One week, the empire is buzzing about military threats from the north. The next, it's too busy gossiping about who the emperor's next spouse will be. It's chaos, but it's chaos under his control. You're swept toward the banquet tables, where platters of figs and pomegranates are passed alongside goblets of wine spiced with saffron. Somewhere, a poet is reciting verses so florid they almost drip from the air. The marriage may not last the season, but for tonight, the empire is united in fascination. And as you watch the emperor lean across the table to feed his new spouse a slice of honey cake, you realize something. Elagabalus isn't just unpredictable. He's weaponized unpredictability itself. In a court where alliances shift with each vow spoken, the only constant is that tomorrow there might be another wedding. You wake to the sound of waves slapping against the hull of a royal barge. The sun is already high, painting the Thames a murky silver as you drift toward a different palace, one that smells faintly of salt and scandal. This time, you're about to step into the tangled world of King Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch. Mainstream fact. Charles restored the monarchy in 1660 after years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell. Quirky tidbit, his bedchamber was as politically important as his throne room. His mistresses weren't just lovers, they were power players. Historians still argue whether Charles genuinely loved them all, or if he saw relationships primarily as a form of political alliance. Stepping off the barge, you're greeted by an explosion of color. Courtiers in shimmering satins and silks, ladies with towering hairstyles, wired and powdered into architectural wonders. The air hums with laughter, music, and the faintly illicit whiff of perfume, strong enough to mask 100 unwashed wigs. You spot Charles instantly. He's tall, dark-haired, and moves with that loose feline grace that makes people lean toward him without realizing it. His smile is quick, but there's always a shadow of calculation behind it, as though every quip and compliment is part of a larger game. He waves you over, introduces you to a small circle of companions, and before you know it, you're sipping wine in the company of two of his most famous mistresses, Nell Gwyn and Louise de Querouaille. Nell is quick with her tongue, in every sense of the phrase, firing jokes and insults with a grin that could cut glass. Louise is softer, speaking in low, accented tones, her glances layered with unspoken meaning. Both women are clearly rivals, but here in Charles's orbit, rivalry is its own kind of performance art. The king delights in the friction. He listens to their teasing jabs with eyes half closed, as if savoring a good wine. Every so often, he interjects, just enough to keep the tension from breaking into open war. Its court politics is cabaret, with the monarch as master of ceremonies. At dinner, the table groans with roasted pheasants, sugared fruits, and trenchers thick with dripping. Charles sits at the head, one hand idly stroking a tiny spaniel perched on his lap. You realize this is not just feasting, it's staging. His casual generosity, the easy laughter, the way he invites even minor courtiers into the joke, it all builds the persona of a king who is both accessible and utterly untouchable. Later in the gardens, you find yourself walking beside him, The manicured hedges twist into private alcoves, and Charles uses one to confide in you. "You know," he says, "a kingdom is like a mistress. Keep her entertained and she'll stay loyal. Neglect her and she'll find someone else." His tone is light, but the message is sharp. You pass a fountain where more whispered conversations bloom in the shadows. Somewhere behind you, laughter bursts like champagne. You wonder how much of this charm is genuine and how much is calculated survival after years of exile and uncertainty. As night falls, the palace glows with candlelight, the king's silhouette visible through a tall window, head bent toward someone in a gown you don't recognize. The curtain closes, and the scene fades, and you're left with the sense that Charles's reign is a long, intricate seduction of women, of courtiers, and of a country still deciding whether to trust him again. It's a colder morning now, your breath misting in the damp air as you step into a drafty stone corridor. Somewhere, a door slams, followed by the thud of boots and a low, angry voice. You've wandered into the court of Peter the Great of Russia, a monarch whose appetites and ambitions could flatten entire cities, and often did. Mainstream historical fact? Peter modernized Russia in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, dragging it, sometimes quite literally, toward European styles of governance, dress, and industry. Quirky tidbit? He personally took part in drunken days-long parties with his so-called all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, a kind of mock court where rules existed purely to be broken. Historians still argue whether these endless feasts were just personal indulgence or a twisted form of political theater designed to test loyalty. The man himself is hard to miss, towering over everyone at nearly 7 feet, with the kind of presence that makes rooms go quiet without him even speaking. His coat is military cut but gaudy with gold trim. His boots are spattered with mud from some inspection or other. He notices you immediately, beckoning you forward with a bear-sized hand. Before you can even manage a greeting, he's thrusting a goblet of something strong smelling into your hand. It burns your throat on the way down, the taste somewhere between kerosene and overripe fruit. "Good," he says, clapping you on the shoulder hard enough to make you stumble. "Now you are ready for business." Business in Peter's world seems to mean a whirlwind tour. One minute you're in a shipyard where sawdust clogs the air as laborers shape hulking wooden hulls, Peter himself grabbing tools to demonstrate proper technique. The next minute you're in a long candlelit hall where platters of roast meat and barrels of vodka await the king's joking synod, already well into its revels. The laughter here is loud and sometimes cruel. A man in a bishop's hat made of bread singing an off-key hymn while another pretends to bless a pig. You notice the eyes of the participants. Many look merry, but some dart nervously toward Peter, as if gauging his mood before daring to laugh. You get the sense that refusing to join in would be unwise. Between bites and gulps, Peter talks about his plans, new ship designs, foreign alliances, the founding of a new capital, St. Petersburg, on a swamp. He gestures expansively, describing palaces, churches, and harbors where there's currently nothing but reeds and water. You shiver, partly from the damp draft, partly from imagining the sheer manpower it would take to build such a thing in such a place. At one point, he leans in close, his breath heavy with drink. "A ruler," he says, "must know every skill of his people. A shipwright, a soldier, a doctor, even a barber." Before you can react, he whips a razor from his pocket, and in a few terrifying seconds, shaves off half your mustache with alarming precision. The room bursts into laughter, though you're not sure whether you're in on the joke or the butt of it. Later, in the chill night air, you stand by the water. The king is still inside, roaring approval at some crude toast. Across the black surface of the river, you can just make out the skeletal beginnings of what will be St. Petersburg. It's bleak and unwelcoming now, but you can almost see what Peter sees. Stone palaces rising from the mud, ships flying Russian colors, canals glittering in the sun. You leave the court that night smelling of wood smoke, alcohol, and candle wax, your upper lip strangely cold where the king's blade made its mark. You've seen monarchs who charm, who manipulate, who seduce. But Peter the Great? He simply sweeps you up in his current, and if you can't keep up, you sink. The wind changes again, not just in temperature but in mood. The air feels lighter, saltier, and you hear the distant call of gulls before the sound of rolling carriage wheels on cobblestones. You've arrived in 19th century Bavaria, at the twilight of a monarchy already fading under the weight of modern politics. This is the world of Ludwig I, a man both adored and derided as the last great royal libertine. If Peter the Great was a tidal wave, Ludwig is a warm, languid tide, pulling you into opulence without you realizing how deep you've waded. His palace is drenched in light, the high windows open to let in the scents of lilacs and city bakeries. Inside, every wall seems to bear a portrait of an impossibly beautiful woman. Some are queens, some courtesans, some barely more than rumors turned into oil and canvas. Ludwig called them his gallery of beauties, commissioning his court painter to immortalize women from every walk of life, nobility, opera singers, maids, and merchants' daughters alike. When he greets you, he's dressed with a kind of calculated negligence. A velvet jacket open at the throat, a cravat loosened, the faintest trace of rosewater clinging to him. His smile is the sort that makes you feel both seen and evaluated in the same instant. He wastes no time ushering you into what he calls his salon of pleasures, though the room itself is more refined than scandalous at first glance. There are no wild revelries here, not yet, just velvet divans, low tables set with fruit and wine, and an atmosphere thick with flirtation. Musicians play something soft in the corner, and the conversation around you hums with witty barbs and double meanings. Ludwig is a man obsessed with beauty, but not just in the aesthetic sense. He seems genuinely convinced that beauty, whether in people, art, or architecture, is the highest moral good. A kingdom without beauty, he tells you, is a kingdom without soul. This philosophy explains his tireless patronage of the arts and his equally tireless pursuit of beautiful women, though he treats the latter as just another form of collecting. The scandal of his life, of course, revolves around one particular muse, Lola Montez. She's here tonight, arriving fashionably late, wearing a dark blue gown cut just low enough to cause a stir. Born in Ireland, posing as a Spanish dancer, she has the sort of confidence that bends a room toward her. Ludwig's eyes follow her the way some men follow comets, bright, dangerous, and destined to burn. It's not long before the evening turns more decadent. The wine flows, the jokes sharpen, and the soft music is replaced by something livelier. Someone suggests a game, an intimate mix of charades and truth-telling, and Ludwig agrees instantly. Soon, people are miming out notorious political scandals while others act out scenes from romantic plays, all under a haze of laughter and wine. You find yourself pulled into a guessing round with Lola as your partner. She is clever, quick-witted, and perhaps enjoying herself at Ludwig's expense. When you both win the round, Ludwig laughs, though you notice a flicker of something else in his gaze. Possessiveness, perhaps, or forewarning. By the time you step out onto the balcony, the moon is high over Munich, silvering the rooftops. From here, you can see the city Ludwig has shaped. Museums, opera houses, wide boulevards, all the monuments to beauty he's scattered like jewels. You also see, faintly, the darker shadows creeping in, political unrest, Republican murmurs, and the kind of scandal that can topple a crown. Ludwig will not die in exile like some monarchs you've met, but the years ahead will tarnish his image. Tonight, though, he remains in his element, surrounded by art, wine, and the glow of candlelight reflecting in the eyes of the beautiful. As you leave, the strains of laughter and music fade behind you. The journey has carried you through centuries of royal excess, from medieval courts to imperial palaces, from whispered scandals to thunderous spectacles. You've seen kings who ruled with charm, with cruelty, with genius, and with pure appetite. And you realize, stepping back into the cool night, that history isn't made only in the council chambers and battlefields. Sometimes, it's written in the quiet games, the stolen glances, the private obsessions, and the long, unbroken thread of human desire.